Part 2, Climate Apartheid. Nancy Tuana, in her 2019 article, Climate Apartheid, The Forgetting of Race in the Anthropocene, argues along similar lines against the neglect of race in much of the mainstream discourse on the Anthropocene. Tuana's article advocates developing an ecologically informed, intersectional approach designed to disclose the ways racism contributes to the construction of illegible lives in the domain of climate policies and practices. Tuana argues against emphasizing too much the issue of the differential impacts of climate change. She insists that while such differential impact is an important dimension, it is ultimately inadequate to understanding and responding to both climate justice and environmental racism. What is required, she contends, is a rich understanding of the histories and lineages of the deep incorporation of racism and environmental exploitation. In the article, Tuana sketches the lineages of three such instances of the intermingling of racism and environmental exploitation: climate adaptation practices in Lagos, Nigeria, the enmeshment of race and coal mining in the post-Civil War United States, and the infusing of precarity and rainforest destruction in Brazil. Tuana begins by acknowledging that thanks to the work of various activist organizations and feminist scholars, the past 2 decades have been witness to a growing recognition of the gender dimensions of climate change. Nevertheless, like Pulido and Vergés, she goes on to insist that there is rarely attention to the role of race or racism on issues of climate justice. Tuana calls for an ecologically informed intersectionality, one capable not only of illuminating how the lineages of oppressions between differences such as sex, class, sexuality, and race can be intermeshed, but can also animate attention to the infusing of such lineages with environmental exploitation. Tuana insists, furthermore, that we need, in addition to understand how racism is deeply incorporated into various institutions and social practices relevant to the current climate regime. To this end, she contends, ecologically informed intersectional analyses must be accompanied by genealogical sensibilities. Her hope being that through the genealogical sensibility of ecologically informed intersectional analyses, we animate our desire for new values, for new ways of feeling, thinking, and living. In sum, her call is for ecologically informed intersectional analyses accompanied by genealogical sensibilities. Such a method of analysis, she insists, will allow for a far deeper understanding of the phrase environmental racism than is currently embraced. To open up the space for this type of approach, we must begin by asking such questions as, when we engage in the work of climate justice, to whom are we speaking and for what purposes? Who remains silent or silenced? What lives have been rendered illegible? Tuana next introduces a concept articulated by Bishop Desmond Tutu, namely that of climate apartheid, which she insists stands as a vivid reminder of the imperative to attend to the practices, habits, legal institutions, discourses, and impacts of anthropogenic climate change from an ecologically informed sense. Apartheid, Tuna emphasizes, involved deeply held systematic beliefs and dispositions regarding racial superiority that not only impacted individual beliefs and practices, but were infused into and supported by the interactions of various social institutions, such as education, labor, and policing, and the practices and dispositions they authorized. By analogy, Tuana continues, to appreciate the nature and import of climate change apartheid, then requires attention to the more subtle, normalized, and often muted ways in which systematic institutional racism circulates in societies, as well as the ways in which it is impacted by other forms of systemic oppression, such as those due to gender, sexuality, or class. In sum, she highlights, climate apartheid emerges from complex exchanges between racism and environmental exploitation. The sensibility that Tuana urges us, therefore, to develop is one that is attuned to the injustices buried beneath the differential impacts of anthropogenic climate change, as well as those that are the unspoken ground of the choices made and ignored on how to adapt. Which leads Tuana in turn to raise the difficult questions. To what are we willing to adapt? What do we see as in need of adaptation, and what remains unseen, or if seen, not valued? Who and what gets protected? Who and what is rendered more precarious? Do we see or even care about these types of, perhaps unintended, harms or adaptation practices? With such questions on the mind, Tuana next turns to the first of her 3 case studies, the building of the flashy city of Eco Atlantic in Lagos, in response to the sea level rise and warming oceans that are placing Lagos at risk of serious threats from storm surges and flooding events, resulting not only in loss of lives and infrastructure, but also intrusion of seawater into freshwater sources and ecosystems. She asks, who will live in Echo Atlantic's gleaming towers? To which she responds, it is clear that it will not be the over 60% of Nigeria's population, almost 100 million, who live in extreme poverty. Indeed, she contends, Echo Atlantic's shiny towers of luxury apartments are targeted to the wealthy, very likely a majority of wealthy foreign business representatives, along with a minority of the wealthiest of Nigerians. Furthermore, she continues, given income demographics, the majority of the residents of Echo Atlantic are not likely to be Nigerians, and those who are will be the wealthy, living in the equivalent of a walled and fortified community, one with its own energy and water resources. Tuana then turns to sketch the lineages of the current situation, seeking to trace the history behind how race and class circulate in complex ways in Lagos. She writes, the complexities of histories of slave holding in the territory that has come to be known as Lagos is one such lineage. But it was a lineage which was transmuted by the rise of the external slave trade at Lagos in the 18th century with the rise of sugar plantations in the Caribbean, gold mining in Brazil, and tobacco, rice, and cotton plantations in the Americas. Later, she continues, British annexation of the territory that included Lagos and colonial rule of all of what was subsequently became Nigeria rethreaded lineages as British economic interests. In this instance, the growing demand for palm oil intersected with their mid-19th century campaign to end slave trading. And yet she emphasizes the internal slave trade, yet another thread in this complex weave of lineages that contribute to racism in Lagos, continued without impediment. Moreover, another thread in this racist lineage are the laws that were set up by the British to prohibit indigenous people from importing or exporting any goods. To this end, she points out that the palm oil production in addition reinforced gender roles in Yoruba land, for men's labors were limited to harvesting and transporting, while women were responsible for the labor that produced the oil. Tuana concludes that the protection created by Echo Atlantic is literally built on the devastation of others, both human and non-human animal others, as well as communities and ecosystems. And she notes as well that many other previously undesirable water-based locations, such as Otolo, Kbame, Ilubirin, and Ebute Ikate, are now seen as prime waterfront real estate opportunities and have suffered similar fates, which leads her to reflect. What we see in Lagos is what we see with apartheid in South Africa. We see a city in which those who are already privileged enhance their privilege at the expense of those whose inequalities are made even more severe and do so along divisions put into place due to the impact of decades of racist beliefs and institutions. In this instance, Tuana emphasizes, it is also accomplished by directing and often exploiting climate adaptation practices. The justifying logic is complex, and in its whirl of complexity we need, she concludes, to take the time to trace the lineages of racism in the contours of the choices and reveal how sedimented, systematic beliefs and dispositions regarding racial superiority are at the heart of decisions about whose lives and lifeways are worth protecting and whose are expendable. She concludes the section by contrasting such developments to the ongoing struggle for self-determination of the Ogoni people, bringing into focus their fight against oil companies like Shell, who were drilling oil on indigenous lands. She quotes the brother of the executed leader of the movement, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who invokes the concept of environmental racism in framing their struggle, and she urges us to listen carefully, for the circulations of race in the Anthropocene have fleshly lives and lineages. Tuana then turns to discuss her second case study, that of coal mining and convict labor in the post-Civil War US South. The goal of her ecologically informed intersectional genealogy is once again to gesture at the importance of unburying histories so as to become attuned to how complex lineages of race, class, and gender permeate and inform contemporary beliefs and practices. By doing so, she seeks to counter the determined forgetting of the fleshly labors that built nations, in this case by bringing into focus the legacy of enforced labor in southern coal mines. Tuana notes that human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and agricultural practices are among the largest contributors to climate change. Of them, coal is one of the largest single sources of CO2 emissions. However, she also stresses that the impacts of coal go far beyond the greenhouse gases emitted when it is burned. Indeed, she emphasizes, coal's lineages incorporate racist lineages. To make the case, she begins by referring to studies that have documented the negative impact of coal-fired plants, as well as the disproportionate negative impact on Black and Latin American communities due to the siting of plants in neighborhoods with high percentages of people from one or both groups. But she seeks to go beyond such studies, which she contends do not mine the deep and long histories of the infusions of racist exploitation and environmental exploitation, which do not travel deeply enough into the ways racism was and is often literally incorporated into institutions and social practices, as well as into the flesh. And she proceeds to trace some of the paths of this incorporation. Tuana points out that the war ended chattel slavery as a legal institution in the United States, but it did not end its influence on the hearts and minds of many white Southerners or mitigate its impact on the bodies of many former slaves. She goes on to sketch how a series of willful duplicities created a new system of enforced labor, whether through the exploitative sharecropping arrangements or the convict lease system. The bodies of slaves were treated as a source of fuel, something to be put to work and to be consumed into the work of earning a profit. It was the energy of slaves by an only slightly different name. To this end, she highlights the criminalization of Black life, designed to exploit it in coal mines. Vagrancy laws served this purpose. According to Tuana, the broadness of vagrancy laws allowed widespread misuse, which was used to arrest and fine freed Blacks. Most of these laws had a provision that failure to pay the fine could result in convict leasing. The consequences were indeed grim. Unfree labor practices resulted not only in deplorable working conditions, but also in high levels of death for those sentenced. Alabama's convict leasing program fueled the coal industry. Tuana dwells on the significance of the bodily incorporation of coal dust among those working in the coal mines. She contends that this bodily incorporation of coal dust was one of the consequences of the incorporation of the bodily labor of Blacks into the flourishing of the post-war economy in the US South and into the wealth of corporations like the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, the profits of which were merged with the United States Steel Corporation in 1907. Racism was, she concludes, in this way literally incorporated into the environmental harms caused by coal mining, from the impacts on groundwater to the release of methane to acid mine drainage, which leads her to reflect, we might all be vulnerable to the unpredictability of fate, but we are not all equally vulnerable to the many types of violence perpetrated by systematic oppression. To ignore how such violence is deeply woven into the textures of environmental exploitation is a form of indifference that is at the heart of the type of environmental racism to which we must become attuned. Not simply the differential impacts, but the layered, habituated disposabilities of certain people and certain ecosystems, and their often complexly intertwined lineages. Tuana then turns to her final case study, namely the infusing of precarity and rainforest destruction in Brazil. She highlights again, understanding the ways in which Brazil incorporates modern slavery into their economy requires a genealogical sensibility, one that brings racism and environmental exploitation together. To this end, she begins by noting that the Global Slavery Index estimates that 155,000 people are currently being exploited by unfree labor practices in Brazil. In the modern landscape of Brazil, unfree labor circulates between class and race, for it is the press of poverty that leads men and women into slave labor. But she continues by pointing out that the weave of poverty is inflected with racism and continues as it does in the United States as one of the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. Tuana writes that while it is no longer legal to own another person, control over workers through fear and intimidation is used to force individuals to work long hours under inhumane living conditions. And she bears witness to the fact that those engaged in deforestation or charcoal production are expected to work 10-hour days with few, if any, days off. Violence, including brutal murders, are used to control workers and curb resistance. Tuana further notes that those studying slavery in Brazil have noted the clear links between it and environmental exploitation. To this end, she quotes Kevin Bales, who in his 2016 book, Blood and Earth, Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the World, eloquently wrote, "We know that the hidden crimes of slavery and environmental destruction are not just inextricably linked, but mutually reinforcing and reach around the planet. We know that slaves are used to destroy the environment, and that when an ecosystem is devastated, the people who live within it are pushed closer to slavery." In sum, the three case studies which Tuana presents are intended to illuminate the persistent infusions of racism and environmental exploitation through the method of detailed genealogical tracings of such lineages. She ends with an emphasis on method, arguing that ecologically informed intersectional analysis must be to the detailed, historical, spatial, situated genealogies of the incorporations of racism and environmental exploitations. Indigenizing the Anthropocene. In indigenizing the Anthropocene, the Métis scholar Zoe Todd undertakes an examination of art and the Anthropocene as variations of white public space, space in which indigenous ideas and experiences are appropriated or obscured by non-indigenous practitioners. She does so first by offering a short exploration of how to use indigenous philosophy and teachings from indigenous legal orders, specifically the work of Pappas Chase Cree scholar Dr. Duane Donald, to decolonize and indigenize the non-indigenous intellectual contexts that currently shape public intellectual discourse, including that of the Anthropocene. She furthermore explores how the indigenization of the Anthropocene is taking place through indigenous thought, praxis, and art. This decolonization/indigenization, she contends, is necessary in order to bring indigenous epistemologies, ontologies, and practices to the fore in a meaningful and ethical way. Towards the beginning of the essay, Todd confesses that as a Métis scholar, she has an inherent distrust of this term, the Anthropocene, since terms and theories can act as gentrifiers in their own right, and that frequently she has to force herself to engage in good faith with it as a heuristic. To this end, she refers to the Swedish scholars Andreas Malm and Alf Hornborg, who, among others, have highlighted the manner in which the current framing of the Anthropocene blunts the distinctions between the peoples, nations, and collectives who drive the fossil fuel economy and those who do not. For as Todd emphasizes, not all humans are equally implicated in the forces that created the disasters driving contemporary human environmental crises. She adds furthermore that not all humans are equally invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. Todd poses the question, what modernist mess characterizes this moment of common cosmopolitical concern that is the Anthropocene? And she continues, who is dominating the conversations about how to change the state of things? Todd seeks to critically interrogate the Euro-Western Academy's current approach to human environmental relationships. She chastises fashionable post-humanist theories for tending to erase both location and indigenous epistemologies. Instead, she cites approvingly Juanita Sundberg, who urges scholars to enact the pluriverse as a decolonial tool, in her case drawing on Zapatista principles of walking the world into being as one locus of thought and praxis to decolonize post-humanist scholarship and geographies. Likewise, she follows Sarah Hunt, who has outlined the epistemic violence inherent in Euro-Western academic treatments of indigenous knowledge, specifically by analyzing the ways that indigenous ontologies are reified and distorted in the ongoing colonial structures of the European and North American academy. She appeals to Hunt's evocation of dance as a way to negotiate the demands of colonial academic institutions and praxis, for it is, she claims, through dance that indigenous ontologies are brought to life. To the same end, she references Zakiya Jackson, who also problematizes the erasure of race from post-humanist philosophies, bringing the focus back to topics all too often sidestepped by post-humanism, including race, colonialism, and slavery. Todd goes on to cite the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe scholar Vanessa Watts, who has operationalized a principle of indigenous place thought, which can stand in place of or alongside discourses such as an ontology of dwelling, the theoretical position advanced by British anthropologist Tim Ingold, based in part on his close reading of Irving Hallowell's ethnographic work with Anishinaabe people. Todd highlights how Watts rejects the hierarchies of agency imposed by common understandings of actor network theory, and suggests instead that if we think of agency as being tied to spirit, and spirit exists in all things, then all things possess agency. Which leads her to pose the question, what do these critiques of post-humanism have to do with the Anthropocene? Her reply, put simply, both threads of inquiry, post-humanism and the Anthropocene, share a terrain, even if they do not have in common the same central emphasis in their respective discourses. Todd further explains, the Anthropocene narrative gathers discursive steam, dominating contexts where other discourses struggle to circulate. And it dominates in what is an undeniably white intellectual space of the Euro-Western Academy. It is perhaps unsurprising, she contends, for popular thought to be Eurocentric, when the institutions and structures within which it is generated continue to be largely heteropatriarchal, Eurocentric, and white. Or posed in the form of the question, she asks, If the academy structures reproduce whiteness, what can we expect of the stories it is telling about the Anthropocene and our shared struggles to engage with dynamic environmental crises on the planet? Todd refers to the work of J. Martineau and E. Ritzkes, who have both highlighted the ongoing whiteness of mainstream art praxis, positing indigenous art as a counter-narrative to the heteropatriarchy and white supremacy that informs artistic discourses. They argue that the task of the decolonial artists, scholars, and activists is not simply to offer amendments or edits to the current world, but to display the mutual sacrifice and relationality needed to sabotage colonial systems of thought and power for the purpose of liberatory alternatives. Todd further adds that the non-human must also be incorporated into this equation. She insists, there is no way to get around the fact that the business of making knowledge and making art in the European and North American academies is still very much a Eurocentric endeavor. Todd stresses the importance of ethical relationality, invoking to this end the work of the Papiss-Chase Cree scholar Duane Donald, who has linked the cultivation of such an ethic to an enactment of ecological imagination. According to Donald, ethical relationality doesn't deny that we're different, so it's not a way of saying we're all the same, but it seeks to understand more deeply how our different histories and experiences position us in relation to each other. It puts those at the forefront, who you are, where you come from, what your commitments are, what your experiences have been. So it's a desire to acknowledge and honor the significance of the relationships we have with others, how our histories and experiences position us in relation to each other, and how our futures as people in the world are similarly tied together. It is an ethical imperative to see that despite our varied place-based cultures and knowledge systems, we live in the world together and must constantly think and act with reference to those relationships. Todd further cites Donald's indigenous understanding of ecology. In Donald's words, ecology, the way I think of it, the way I've been taught to think about it, is paying attention to the webs of relationships that you are enmeshed in, depending on where you live. So those are all the things that give us life, all the things that we depend on, as well as the other entities that we relate to, including human beings. Todd goes on to introduce Donald's concept of indigenous métissage, which he defines as a place-based approach informed by an ecological and relational understanding of the world. Todd contends that in order to mobilize indigenous métissage, there must be an ethic of historical consciousness. To this end, she again cites Donald, who argues that this ethic holds that the past occurs simultaneously in the present and influences how we conceptualize the future. In sum, for Todd, an orientation towards Donald's philosophical framework helps to address the shortcomings that Malm and Hornborg identify in the current framings of the Anthropocene, which currently acts as white public space and erases the differential histories and relationships that have led to current environmental crises. Historical consciousness, ethical relationality, and indigenous métissage, she insists, rooted in reciprocity, relationships, and responsibility are among many principles the Eurocentric Academy struggles to address in current framings and responses to the Anthropocene. Donald offers a philosophy rooted in the things he has learned from Cree and Blackfoot legal orders and his experiences in the world. His ethical relationality and indigenous métissage, she continues, are processes through which to move away from human-centric discourses about the Anthropocene and to envision ourselves as rooted in reciprocal, ongoing, and dynamic relationships that are informed by indigenous legal orders and our embeddedness in the meshworks that connect us through an ecological imagination. Such relationality, she concludes, can inform decolonizing approaches to both art and anthropology in the Anthropocene. Todd further emphasizes that decolonization requires that we change not only who is spoken about and how, but also who is present in intellectual and artistic buildings. This is because, she contends, there are so few indigenous bodies within the European Academy. Even when they are present, she insists, they are often dismissed as biased, overly emotional, or unable to maintain objectivity over the issues they present. Todd concludes her essay by insisting that the Anthropocene, like any theoretical category at play in Euro-Western contexts, is not innocent of epistemic violence. Exploitative patterns, when they manifest, in turn concentrate the voice of indigenous issues in white hands. She urges that rather than engage with the Anthropocene as a teleological fact implicating all humans as equally culpable for the current socioeconomic, ecological, and political state of the world, we should turn to examining how other peoples are describing ecological imagination. Furthermore, she insists that art, as one mode of thought and praxis, can play a role in dismantling the condos of the art and academic world and help us build something different in their stead. And to this end, she points to indigenous artists who offer an important perspective on the intertwined and relational connections between people and land, and through their art can craft concrete responses to the mess and violence of the economies operating in the Anthropocene. With that, we'll take another break.